Okay, so this is part two of the JP Morgan experience. If you missed any of part one, or you don't know, like if you missed any of the notes from part one, they are in the last post from last week. I think it was October the 11th. I will repost them on today's lesson as well. So, part one was a little bit of a background for how Morgan got started in his business. Give me a second here. I'm going to pause this for a moment. I'll be right back. Okay, sorry about that. I just realized there was a typo I had to address. So we're picking up looking at JP Morgan and Company, the JP Morgan business that was started at the end, well, when Drexel Morgan changed over because of the death of Anton Drexel. Because of his background and his schooling, Morgan had connections with every major banking firm in the US and in Europe. And with that money, Morgan specifically began doing what's called investment capitalism or finance capitalism or investment banking, let's say. He used his banks to invest specifically in businesses. Now, that didn't mean that normal people couldn't necessarily bank with them, but what it meant was is that their specialty was dealing in businesses, particularly as we talked about yesterday or in the last lesson, businesses that were having problems and needed to be fixed. That's reorganization, or taking multiple businesses that did the same thing and joining them together. That's business consolidation. One of the beautiful things about Morgan is his brilliance in looking at the business situations around him. Reorganization. Morgan took failing companies and he fixed them. What he got really good at this, and this is ended up resulting in people would look at, like, Morgan, oh my gosh, it'd be like newspaper would go JP Morgan buying such and such a company. Businessmen who would read that in a newspaper, or wealthy people who would read that in a newspaper, or even middle class or lower middle class people with even a few dollars to invest would read this. If JP Morgan thought something was worth getting into, it meant that it was a good bet. So this generated outside investment. So the way that that works is you buy stock, which is shares of ownership in a company. As Morgan took over a failing company, that stock's value was really low. Morgan bought it super low. As people began to look and go, well, if Morgan likes it, it must be good, they would buy stock as well. That stock value would start to go up. The more it went up, the more people looked at it and said that it was a good bet and they should be in it. They start buying more. The stock value keeps going up. This generates reinvestment into a failing company, which means that there's money being introduced. That money can be used to fix what the problems are. And generally, the problem is one of inefficiency. So I'm going to underline this here. Morgan's real issue with businesses had to do with his belief in their inefficiency. Inefficiency is not doing things the best or smartest or cheapest way that you can. Now, in some cases, those things don't all go together, but an oversimplified way to look at it is this. Morgan would take companies that weren't doing well, and he would look at them and he would see the areas where they weren't doing well, and he would fix those. Maybe the problem was is that you needed to ship out 1,000,000 widgets, and your widget shipping cost you 10 cents for every widget, which meant that you needed $100,000 to ship your widgets. Morgan would look at it and go, well, wait a second. We can cut the cost of shipping from 10 cents a widget down to 7 cents a widget, which means that it may not seem like much, but if you think about 1,000,000 widgets, you go from having to spend $100,000 to ship those widgets down to having to spend only 70,000. That's a pretty big chunk of savings. Now, take that across the board and look at every aspect of production. Maybe those widgets cost you $1 to make. Well, Morgan figured out a way to make them for 87 cents, which meant that you saved 13 cents on every widget. 13 cents isn't much unless you're talking about 1,000,000 widgets. Then you're looking at $130,000. All of these things began adding up. This is how he would fix things. His belief is that inefficiency was sort of like the thing that was wrong with most companies and with businesses in general. Now, there is a rather odd sort of like byproduct of this, however. This attack on inefficiency results in the creation of monopolies and the creation of things called trusts. Monopoly is when one person or business owns all of a specific good or service. So where that literally you can't really compete against them. Monopolies are problematic because their control may make things more efficient, but it can also lead to things like corruption, laziness, poor quality, and overly high charges on things. Now, what is a trust? A trust is a type of monopoly, but it's a special type of monopoly. A trust is a company that produces no goods or services. What it does is it buys up other companies in the same industry. So, a great example of this was the Northern Securities Corporation, which was a railroad trust owned by J.P. Morgan and James J. Hill. And it didn't produce any goods or services. What it did was it owned a bunch of little railroad companies. So why or what is the purpose of this? By owning all those companies, you reduce the inefficiency, you increase efficiency. Also, you eliminate competition, making it more streamlined and easier for you to get the job done quicker without having to worry about like people getting in your way. The other thing is that when people like investors buy into a trust, they're getting profits from all of the companies that the trust owns, not just from one company. So it's a real way to make money. The problem is that it really does prevent competition, and if left sort of like unchecked, it can become tyrannical and make it nearly impossible for people to like do business because the prices will be so high. One of the genius things that Morgan would do was utilize something known as the interlocking directorate. Now, this is a complicated issue, and if you can understand it, it really will make things a lot easier. The idea of the interlocking directorate is that the same group of people who are in charge of a company, so let's say that you have 5 people in charge of a railroad company. One person is the president, one person is the vice president, one person is the chief financial officer, one person is the director of marketing, one person is the director of business. That railroad company needs certain things to function. It needs coal to make the train run. It needs oil to grease the wheels up and to keep things lubricated. It needs wood to build the railroad tracks out of. It needs steel to put the rails on the tracks. It needs all of these things. All of those things cost money. So what the concept of interlocking directorates is that those 5 people who own the railroad would buy a coal company, a steel company, a lumber company, and an oil company. And they would simply, the same 5 people would own all of those, but they would change their job titles from company to company. So it looked like 5 different people actually owned them. They would then make special deals with their original company so they could get stuff super cheap. So, for example, the railroad company might be able to buy lumber for 25 cents as opposed to paying $1. In exchange, the lumber company puts its stuff on those railroads to be shipped at half the price of what it would cost anywhere else. This benefits all the companies who are owned by the same people. This is illegal now, largely because of what JP Morgan did and how he ran his business. It really also stifles competition. The interlocking directorate, however, it was really driven by this idea of efficiency and what was good for business. It made more sense to be able to procure stuff cheaper, which in theory, if you really follow this through, you can then pass along those savings to the customer, which will increase your business, making it all the more profitable and supporting and encouraging you to be more efficient. Now, Just to give you an example of how successful JP Morgan was with this, here is a little view of all the companies that JP Morgan owned. Here's a picture of JP. Some of them you may recognize. For example, American Telephone and Telegraph, also known as AT&T. General Electric, GE. You may not necessarily recognize the name immediately, but International Harvester and JI Case, that is Case Harvester International. They are the largest producer of farm tractors in the world. United States Steel Corporation, formerly known as Carnegie Steel. Here is a list of all the railroads that they owned. Some of these may be kind of familiar to you as well. How about the Pennsylvania and Reading railroads? Both railroads from monopoly, they're real things. These are all companies that JP Morgan owned. These companies did special deals with one another to make things more or to make things less expensive. So, for example, any of these railroad companies could buy steel from the Federal Steel Company or from the United States Steel Corporation. They could get coal from the Boomer Coal and Coke Company. There are all sorts of big companies here that Morgan owned directly or indirectly. Now, how much? Now, we talked about this too. He was not the wealthiest man of any of the entrepreneurs by far. He was actually probably the poorest, only being worth about $20 million or so, only. Morgan's banks had enough money that they could bail out the entire U.S. economy, and they did so in 1895, which we're going to talk about this in next unit, but the rather disastrous, actually, we'll talk a bit more about later on this unit, the rather disastrous idea of Benjamin Icewater Harrison. Now, by the way, if you got a nickname like Icewater, you're either a hardcore OG or you're just that boring. He wasn't OG. Due to some really stupid things on the part of the government, um, the United States ran out of gold in 1895. I mean, this actually puts Grant and his whole gold issues to shame. Morgan sold the U.S. government 3.5 million ounces of gold in exchange for government bonds. So, what did that mean? That meant at the end of 30 years, J.P. Morgan would be paid back double gold for what he had sold to the U.S. government. To put that in modern perspective, 3.5 million in today money, 3.5 million ounces, is worth somewhere probably in the neighborhood of $650 billion. Um, so in 30 years' time, Morgan would have flipped that over and he would have been owed 7 million ounces of gold by the U.S. government. That's a lot of money. That's a lot of gold. Now, Morgan is the man. His general worldview. First of all, he was a collector. And why not? If you got that much money, you might as well collect stuff. This is why God doesn't let me have money, by the way. So, um, as far as what did he collect? He collected books. His private library formed a huge section of the New York Public Library when he donated. He was an art history major. He owned an enormously large collection of art. His paintings became the New York Museum of Art. That's how many he owned. Gems. Now, this really shows you something here, okay? You know you become a somebody when this happens. This is morganite. It is a gemstone discovered and named after J.P. Morgan because of Morgan's interest in gemology. His gemological collection formed the basis of the U.S. Gemological Institute's exhibits at two World's Fairs in 1889 and in 1900. They also, by the way, became the entire gem exhibit of the American Museum of Natural History at the Smithsonian. He started Harvard Medical School. Okay? He was a philanthropist. The word philanthropist just means lover of man. Philos, love, anthropist, mankind or humanity. So he started the New York Museum of Art with his art collection. He started the American Museum of Natural History, or he gave them their gem wing. He founded Harvard Medical School. That's pretty impressive. The original Trinity College, he started that too. There are hundreds of hospitals and schools all over New York City named after J.P. Morgan because he built all of them. Now, in what is a rather odd, sort of freakish coincidence, Morgan was also a big patron of photography. Specifically, he hired a photographer, probably the most famous and successful photographer of the time, Edward Curtis, to do a photo history of the American Indian in order to preserve American Indian culture for the future. Because Morgan realized that even back then, that their culture was vanishing and was in danger of disappearing. The irony of this is that Morgan himself absolutely loathed photographers. He hated them. He would actually physically attack photographers and beat them with his cane and destroy their camera equipment. Why? Well, not unlike many of us, Morgan was a little self conscious about his physical appearance. Now, you can see here's a picture of young Morgan, okay? Specifically, one thing his nose. Now, it doesn't look that bad here because he's a younger dude. Give me a second and we'll look at the Morgan nose. Here we go. There we go. Look at that right there. Look at how bulby and everything and bumpy it is. Morgan suffered from a very severe form of rosacea that affected his nose. You can't really tell in this picture. His nose was gigantic, throbbing, and purplish. Now, notice in the background, there's some smiling people here. This picture was actually taken at a school opening in New York for, I believe, one of his nieces. I think that's who that young lady is in the background. The photographer got a picture of him before Morgan knew what was going on, and before he could be attacked, and then he took off. Morgan hated having his nose picture taken. That's why anytime you see him, let's go back to the original picture we had before. Notice here that this picture is straight on, so you really don't get a sense of just how enormous and terrifying that nose is. Okay. Um, Also, going back to the idea of efficiency, Morgan was a big supporter of the World Conference of Churches. It was his belief that all of the different churches of the world made things inefficient. He personally was a member of the Episcopalian Church of America. That's the American branch of the Church of England. It was his belief that you should focus on what these religions have in common and sort of streamline and make religion more efficient so that everybody is pretty much the same religion. And he spent a lot of money in supporting that. Okay, we'll pick the rest of this up later. Well, it's enough for now. Peace and love.